This morning, we continue to follow the search for Nancy Guthrie in Arizona. Investigators say DNA found at her property does not belong to her or anyone close to her, as the case moves into its third week. Friday night, SWAT and forensic teams were seen at a home about 2 miles from hers. Investigators also towed a Range Rover from a nearby restaurant parking lot, though it's not clear if it's connected. Neighbors say the area's layout makes it difficult to see or hear what's happening next door.
The homes are not right next to each other. They're really spread out. A disappearance, a kidnapping in one home, the next house would not even know about it.
Authorities continue to search for a man about 5'9" with an average build, wearing an Ozark Trail backpack. Officials say several gloves have been recovered, but no suspects have been identified.
The front door was already open. That is the detail that stops you cold when you watch the footage frame by frame. Not the figure, not the mask, not even the gun. The front door, wide open at 1:47 in the morning, at the home of an 84-year-old woman who lived alone in the Catalina Foothills outside Tucson, Arizona. Someone had been inside that house before the camera ever caught them leaving. And here is what makes this case different from anything you have probably followed before. Every theory, every lead, every ransom note, every piece of surveillance footage, every forensic detail, all of it keeps pointing back to one number: 92%. In a moment, a leading forensic researcher is going to explain exactly what that number means, why it matters more than anything else investigators have found, and what it tells us about the person who walked out of Nancy Guthrie's front door and into the dark. Before we get there, a word of caution. This case involves the abduction of an elderly woman, ransom demands, forensic evidence of a struggle, and expert analysis of possible homicide. If that is not something you are ready for right now, step away. Come back when you are. This story will still be here, and it deserves your full attention. If you are staying, welcome to the Whispered Crimes. This channel exists because missing people deserve more than a news cycle. If you are new here, subscribe right now, because we go deeper than the headlines on every case we cover. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you are watching from tonight. This case has reached every corner of the globe, and that community is part of why these stories do not get forgotten. Now let us get into it. 9 days passed before the public saw a single frame of footage. 9 days of official silence while a family pleaded publicly, while investigators processed a crime scene in a quiet desert neighborhood, while the country watched and waited. Then on February 10th, 2026, FBI Director Kash Patel released the material himself personally on his own social media account. He did not route it through a press office. He did not schedule a briefing. He posted it directly to X, along with a statement that law enforcement had uncovered previously inaccessible images showing an armed individual appearing to have tampered with the camera at Nancy Guthrie's front door the morning of her disappearance. That level of direct involvement from a sitting FBI director in a missing person case is unusual by any measure. It was a signal about how seriously the federal government was treating what had happened in Tucson. What Patel released had not been sitting in a cloud server waiting to be downloaded. The physical recording device had been removed from the property. Nancy did not have a cloud storage subscription for her Nest camera, which meant the footage should have been gone entirely. Instead, the FBI worked with Google and other private sector partners to extract the material from residual data in back-end systems. What they recovered was enough to change the entire public understanding of the case. The footage showed a sequence of deliberate actions at Nancy's front door. The figure arrived already masked, already gloved, and moved through the camera obstruction in stages. First, a gloved hand raised directly over the doorbell lens. Then the figure stepped away, walked to the front yard, returned holding foliage pulled from a potted plant on Nancy's own property, and used it to cover what the hand had already blocked. Then the camera was physically removed from its mount and taken. Despite all of it, the residual data had survived. Google separately announced on February 18th that it was continuing to work on extracting additional footage from other home camera systems on the property that had been corrupted or rendered inaccessible. That process was still ongoing weeks later. From the recovered images, investigators built a physical description: male, approximately 5'9" to 5'10" tall, average build, a dark mustache visible beneath the mask. He was carrying a black 25-liter Ozark Trail Hiker Pack backpack, a product sold exclusively at Walmart. He was armed, with a firearm visible in a holster positioned at his midsection, closer to his groin than any trained professional would place it. Former FBI agent John Nance reviewed the footage publicly and stated the holster clearly did not fit the semi-automatic pistol the suspect appeared to be carrying. His exact words, "It is incredibly amateur and unsafe, and the gun could easily fall out of that holster." CNN senior law enforcement analyst and former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe was equally direct. "No person with law enforcement or military training," he said, "would ever carry a firearm in a holster positioned like that, right at the center of the body, hanging off the belt." And the holster itself was later identified by investigators as a Strategy brand large frame revolver hip holster, a roughly $10 item available at a limited number of Walmart locations in the Tucson area. The mismatch between a revolver holster and a semi-automatic pistol was another indicator that whoever was wearing it had not prepared for this with any professional guidance. Investigators began canvassing gun shops across the area, asking whether anyone recognized the specific holster or the weapon. The clothing added to that picture. The gloves were thick and heavily lined, the kind designed for cold weather rather than operational use. Former FBI Special Agent Josh Campbell noted publicly that the head-to-toe covering could have been a deliberate attempt to prevent leaving behind DNA from skin, hair fibers, or fingerprints. Whether that precaution worked would become one of the central forensic questions of the investigation. At the scene itself, the physical evidence told a specific story. Blood found on the front porch was confirmed by DNA testing to belong to Nancy. Her phone, her medication, and her personal belongings were all still inside the house. The back door was found propped open, but investigators determined she had been removed through the front entrance. At 1:47 a.m. on February 1st, the doorbell camera at the home had disconnected. At 2:12 a.m., software detected the presence of a person or possibly an animal on a separate camera, but no video was available because there was no service subscription to capture it. Then at 2:28 a.m., the app linked to Nancy's Bluetooth-enabled pacemaker showed a disconnect from her phone. Where the device itself continued functioning, but the remote monitoring connection, the channel that would have transmitted data from her implant back to her clinicians and her family, had gone offline. It had moved out of range of the home network. That 41-minute window between 1:47 and 2:28 was the bracket investigators worked from. To try to find Nancy through her pacemaker signal directly, law enforcement deployed what is known as a signal sniffer. The device was mounted on a helicopter, which flew slowly at low altitude over the areas where investigators were still hoping to locate her. Signal sniffers can detect low-power electronic transmissions of the kind a pacemaker implant emits. The Pima County Sheriff's Department coordinated with the pacemaker manufacturer and Nancy's managing clinic to obtain device logs, event markers, and connectivity timestamps that could narrow the timeline further. The technology was treated as supplementary, useful for generating leads but not definitive without corroborating evidence. On the DNA front, investigators recovered a separate genetic profile from inside the property, material that did not belong to Nancy, and did not match anyone confirmed to have had close recent contact with her. Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed this publicly. That profile was submitted to CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which contains over 26 million genetic profiles, including more than 19 million from people convicted of crimes. The result, 0 hits across the entire system. Then came the glove. Approximately 2 miles from the home, in a field near a roadside, when FBI agents recovered a single black glove that appeared to match the gloves visible on the suspect in the surveillance footage. A DNA profile was extracted and submitted separately to CODIS. That result was also 0. Retired FBI agent Mary Ellen O'Toole, who directs the forensic science program at George Mason University, explained publicly what that means in practice. CODIS only contains profiles from people previously arrested or convicted on qualifying charges. A 0 result does not mean the evidence is unusable. It means the person who left that DNA has no qualifying criminal record in the federal database. There was a significant update to the glove evidence that changed its forensic weight. The DNA recovered from that glove was eventually traced to a local restaurant worker. So Sheriff Nanos confirmed that person was not considered part of the investigation. The glove 2 miles from the home, the one that had initially appeared to be one of the most promising physical leads in the case, was not connected to the suspect. Nanos was measured in how he addressed it publicly, noting that other DNA evidence from inside the property was still being analyzed and remained the higher priority. He stated that the mixed DNA profiles recovered from the scene, material from more than one contributor layered together, required laboratory separation before any further database comparison could proceed. Labs across the country were working on it. Genetic genealogy expert C.C. Moore identified a detail in the footage that pointed toward a possible additional source of DNA. At one point, the suspect was seen holding a small flashlight in his mouth while working near the camera. Moore noted publicly that saliva is significantly more viable as a genetic source than glove contact material. If any surface where saliva may have transferred was recovered from the scene or the immediate area, it could yield a cleaner and more workable profile. The FBI confirmed that investigative genetic genealogy, known as IgG, was underway. IgG does not require a CODIS match. It searches public genealogy databases for partial hits, relatives of the unknown individual who have voluntarily submitted their own DNA to platforms like 23andMe or GEDmatch. From those relative matches, analysts build a family tree backward toward the likely source of the unknown sample. It is the same method that identified the Golden State Killer after more than 30 years. On the physical evidence trail, investigators were working a parallel angle. The Ozark Trail backpack was sold at Walmart. The holster was sold at Walmart. The mask and clothing were also believed to have been purchased at Walmart, though the department clarified they were not exclusively sold there. Investigators spent days reviewing purchase records and surveillance footage at Walmart locations across the Tucson area. Nanos described the backpack as one of the most promising leads in the case. The company provided authorities with records of all Ozark Trail hiker purchases over a multi-month window. Every item of clothing visible in that footage was being traced to its point of sale. Law enforcement also seized and towed a gray Range Rover from the parking lot of a Culver's restaurant approximately 2 miles from Nancy's home. In a late-night operation on February 13th into the early hours of February 14th. FBI agents and Pima County deputies were filmed photographing and searching the vehicle before it was covered and removed. At the same time, law enforcement sealed off a road near East Orange Grove Road and North First Avenue and conducted an operation at a nearby residence. 2 people were removed from that location. Roads were closed for several hours. 1 person was detained and later released after being determined not to be involved. No arrests were made. No public explanation was issued for what specifically drew investigators to either location. A person of interest had also been stopped earlier, on February 10th, during a traffic stop in Rio Rico, Arizona, approximately 60 miles south of Tucson, near the U.S.-Mexico border. A search warrant was executed on a property and vehicle connected to that individual. By the following day, that person had been released without charges. Sheriff Nanos confirmed they were not connected to Nancy's disappearance. The sheriff's department also asked every resident within a 2-mile radius of Nancy's home to submit any surveillance footage captured between January 1st and February 2nd that struck them as unusual. Every camera in the surrounding neighborhood was a potential witness to something investigators had not yet seen. The evidence was real, it was present, it was being actively worked across multiple forensic tracks simultaneously, but it had not yet pointed to a name. While forensic teams worked the physical evidence, a separate and equally complicated element of this case was unfolding across newsrooms in Tucson and beyond. The first note arrived on Monday evening, February 3, 2026, at the Tucson newsroom of KOL, a CBS affiliate, through the station's anonymous online tip submission system. KOL News Director Jessica Babula told News Nation the station received it at approximately 5 p.m. and immediately forwarded it to the FBI and Pima County Sheriff's Department without reporting on it publicly. The station did not go on air with the story until authorities issued a joint statement acknowledging they were aware of ransom note reports. Within approximately 12 hours of KOL receiving that first note, a second Tucson television station received what appeared to be the same communication. TMZ then received it on Tuesday morning, February 4th. The FBI confirmed all 3 notes were identical. What those notes contained immediately separated them from the wave of opportunistic communications that would follow. KOLD anchor Mary Coleman, who read the first note her station received, told CNN that it contained a dollar amount, a deadline, and other specifics that only Guthrie's abductor might know. She said directly, "A lot of it is information that only someone who was holding her for ransom would know. Some very sensitive information and things that people who were there when she was taken captive would know." She added that after a couple of sentences, it was clear to her this might not be a hoax. FBI Phoenix Special Agent in charge Heath Janke confirmed publicly that the note contained details about 2 specific items: Nancy's Apple Watch and a backyard floodlight described as destroyed, information that had not been released to the public, and that the FBI said piqued their interest immediately. TMZ founder Harvey Levin told CNN that the placement of the Apple Watch details specifically was the kind of thing that would make investigators take the note seriously right away. Levin also described the note as carefully crafted, with grammar that was perfect, structured, and layered. The note began, he said, by stating that Nancy was okay but scared, and it specified that the family would have no way of contacting the sender, with clear effort made to ensure the communication stayed anonymous. The note set 2 deadlines, where the first was 5 p.m. on Thursday, February 5th. The second was 5 p.m. on Monday, February 9th, 2026. The demand was $6 million in Bitcoin sent to a specific wallet address. The threat attached to missing the deadline was explicit. TMZ verified that the Bitcoin address listed in the note was a real and active address on the blockchain. Both deadlines passed. No confirmed payment was made through official channels. Then on February 10th, the same day the surveillance footage was released publicly, activity was recorded in that Bitcoin wallet. At least 1 transaction was made to the address around 5 p.m. Arizona time. The amount was not disclosed. Whether it came from investigators, the family, or a third party was never confirmed. To blockchain analytics firm Lionsgate Network CEO Bezalel Ethan Raviv told the New York Post that any payment to that wallet could produce traceable leads, because while Bitcoin addresses are pseudonymous rather than anonymous, the blockchain is a permanent public record. Any conversion of those funds to US dollars through any exchange creates a trail that forensic analysis can follow back to a real-world identity. Former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffindaffer made the same argument publicly. Engaging with the wallet is not a concession to extortion. It is a forensic strategy. The blockchain does not forget. Before those questions could be fully explored, a separate thread in the note story had already produced a result. On February 5th, the same day as the first ransom deadline, the FBI announced the arrest of Derek Colella, a 42-year-old man from Hawthorne, California. Colella had sent text messages to Nancy's oldest daughter, Annie Guthrie, and her husband, Tommaso Chioni, on February 4th, using a VoIP internet phone line capable of spoofing phone numbers. The message read, "Did you get the Bitcoin? We're waiting on our end for the transaction." Court records showed he had pulled family contact information from a public website and admitted to investigators that he had been following the case on television and wanted to see if the family would respond. FBI Phoenix Special Agent in charge Heath Janke announced the arrest at a press conference and was direct in his message to anyone else considering a similar move. To those imposters trying to take advantage and profit from this situation, we will investigate and ensure you are held accountable for your actions. Janke also stated clearly that the FBI was simultaneously treating a separate ransom demand, entirely unconnected to Colella, as potentially coming from the actual abductor. The notes to which the Guthrie family chose to respond publicly were not from Derek Colella. They were the original notes that arrived in the first days of the case through the Tucson stations and TMZ, the ones that contained insider details no member of the public should have known. The family's response was coordinated and deliberate. On February 7th, Savannah Guthrie posted a public video statement. The essential message was 3 words: "We will pay." It was a calculated signal designed to open a direct channel with whoever held Nancy, into establishing the family's willingness to cooperate without conditions. The following day, February 8th, Savannah appeared on Instagram alongside her sister Annie Guthrie and their brother Cameron Guthrie, a retired military colonel who had flown F-16 fighters for 26 years. Together, they addressed the person responsible directly. Savannah said, "You are not lost or alone, and it is never too late to do the right thing." Then on February 16th, Savannah posted a further video with a notably different register. She spoke about believing in the essential goodness of every human being. She spoke about no one being lost or alone. The language was warm, open, and unmistakably spiritual in its framing. Former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffin-Daffer identified something specific in that pattern in a live stream posted on X on April 13, 2026. She said she had initially assumed Savannah's religious language reflected her personal faith. Then she reconsidered. Her reasoning: that is not how you reach somebody. You are just the respondent. You need to relate to what the note writer wrote, not what you think. Her conclusion was that the original notes likely contained scripture, religious quotations, or references that framed the kidnapper's worldview in spiritual terms. Savannah and her team, Coffin-Daffer believed, had mirrored that language deliberately to build psychological common ground with whoever was reading. She went further, stating she wondered whether the individual sees themselves in a godlike way, playing out God, exercising control not just over Nancy's life, but over the entire family's. The full contents of the notes have never been made public. When law enforcement has never confirmed or denied what they contain beyond the Apple Watch and floodlight details. A second note arrived at KOLD on the Friday of the same week, also through the station's anonymous tip system, sent from a different IP address than the first but using similar cloaking software. KOLD declined to call it a ransom note because it made no new demands and provided no proof of life. The station described it as a message. Its connection to the original note or to the actual abductor was not established. Savannah addressed the totality of the notes publicly in a Today interview with Hoda Kotb in the weeks that followed. She said she understood that many of the communications were hoaxes. There are a lot of different notes, I think, that came, she said, and I think most of them, it's my understanding, are not real. She reserved particular contempt for whoever sent the fakes. A person that would send a fake ransom note, she said, really has to look deeply at themselves, to a family in pain. But she drew a specific line: the two notes the family had responded to with video appeals in the first days of the case. She tended to believe those were real. She acknowledged she had not personally seen all of the communications. She could not be certain. Nobody on the outside could. Then came April. On April 6th, 2026, TMZ received two new emails. Both came from the same person who had been sending communications since February, someone who had been demanding 1 Bitcoin in exchange for delivering the kidnappers, as they put it, on a silver platter. The first email said, "I know where her body is and who the kidnapper is." It also stated Nancy was dead. The second email said, "I saw her alive with them in the state of Sonora, Mexico, a large Mexican state bordering Arizona, approximately 70 miles from Tucson." The two claims directly contradicted each other in the same batch of correspondence. The sender also criticized the FBI for dismissing earlier messages as a scam, writing, "It is unbelievable that millions have been wasted, and yet here I am willing to deliver them on a silver platter since the 11th of February for a Bitcoin, but I am disregarded." The timing was April 6, 2026. The same day Savannah Guthrie returned to the Today Show after more than 2 months away from the desk. Coffin-Daffer called it a sucker punch. Whether the sender had genuine information or was an opportunist who had been monitoring the case and chose the most painful possible moment to make contact, the choice of that specific day was not a coincidence. 3 things define the ransom note story when the full sequence is examined. First, the original note sent to KOLD, KGUN9, and TMZ contained verified insider details that law enforcement took seriously enough to treat as potentially genuine. Details about an Apple Watch location and a destroyed floodlight that had not been released publicly. Second, the volume of subsequent fake communications, including a federal arrest, created a forensic noise problem that investigators had to work through methodically to identify which, if any, communications carried genuine information. Third, the 2 notes the family believed were real have never been publicly confirmed as authentic or definitively ruled out. That question remains open. What no subsequent communication has displaced is the original. The note that arrived in the KOLD newsroom on Monday evening, February 3, 2026, written in perfect grammar, structured and layered, beginning with the words that Nancy was okay but scared, and knowing precisely where her Apple Watch was, knew something. Whether the person who wrote it is the person who took her, or someone with access to information from the person who did, the answer to that question is still the most important open thread in this investigation. The ransom notes raised a question that no piece of physical evidence recovered from the scene could answer on its own. If this was not a clean ransom operation, and the evidence strongly suggested it was not, then what was it, and who designed it? That is where the research comes in. Dr. Gary Brucato is a forensic and clinical psychologist and researcher whose career has been built entirely on studying the architecture of violent crime. He is a visiting scholar at Boston College, where he collaborates with Dr. Ann Burgess and researcher Victor Petrecka on forensic research covering homicide, sex crimes, and the psychology of extreme violence. Dr. Burgess is the pioneering criminal profiler whose decades of work with the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit directly inspired the Netflix series Mindhunter, where actress Anna Torv played her fictional counterpart, Dr. Wendy Carr. Dr. Brucato is a member of the expert resource team for the Cold Case Foundation, an organization that assists law enforcement worldwide with challenging, unsolved cases. And in 2019, he co-wrote The New Evil, Understanding the Emergence of Modern Violent Crime, alongside Dr. Michael H. Stone, a comprehensive study of the psychological and sociological patterns behind modern violent offending that is now used as a textbook in several American forensic training programs. Dr. Brucato does not speculate. He does not offer theories for the sake of media attention. He builds forensic profiles from accumulated data, from peer-reviewed research literature, and from decades of studying how real criminals actually behave, in contrast to how the public imagines they do. His method starts with a discipline that most public commentary about this case has skipped entirely. Before you can say anything meaningful about who did this, you have to determine what kind of crime this actually was, not what it appeared to be on the surface, and what the evidence says it was. Dr. Brucato calls these motivational buckets. You evaluate each possible category of motivation against the available evidence, work through each one in sequence, and rule out what does not fit before building toward what does. The first bucket is sexual motivation. Home intrusions driven by sexual motivation reflect a specific and recurring compulsion, a paraphilic drive that repeats over time and leaves a geographic trail of similar offenses in the surrounding area. For an elderly victim, the relevant paraphilia would be gerontophilia, a sexual attraction to elderly individuals. Dr. Brucato describes it as extraordinarily rare in a clinical sense, not merely uncommon but nearly absent from the research literature as a driver of this type of offense. There is also the Richard Ramirez model to consider. Ramirez, the Night Stalker, targeted victims across a wide age range, selecting based on access and vulnerability rather than any specific attraction. A predator operating on that model in Tucson would generate a geographic cluster of similar incidents in surrounding neighborhoods, an observable and trackable pattern. No such pattern exists in the Nancy Guthrie case. There is no physical evidence at the scene consistent with sexual motivation, and none of the behavioral or forensic markers that typically accompany that category of offense. Dr. Brucato ruled it out entirely. The second bucket is financial motivation, and this one is more complicated. Over 1 million financially driven offenses occur in the United States every year, so financial crime is statistically common. But a ransom kidnapping, a specific and well-documented subset of financially motivated crime, has a very particular operational logic. The victim is kept alive because their survival is the leverage. Without proof that the victim is alive, there is no credible transaction. Proof of life arrives within 24 to 48 hours in virtually every documented genuine ransom case because the perpetrator needs to demonstrate to the family that paying is worthwhile. The situation resolves within a week in most documented cases because holding a living person is an enormous operational risk that compounds every hour. The victim's health is actively maintained because a dead or deteriorating victim cannot be exchanged for anything. None of those operational characteristics applied in the Nancy Guthrie case. No confirmed proof of life was ever provided. Nancy was medication dependent with a pacemaker and daily prescription needs, and there was no indication whoever held her was managing her health. No swift resolution occurred. The ransom notes went to newsrooms rather than to the family. Financial motivation may still be a factor in some form, but if it was, something went significantly wrong, or the financial framing was layered over a more personal objective that the surface presentation was designed to conceal. The third bucket is stranger abduction, and the statistics here are among the most clarifying in the entire analysis. Approximately 350 stranger abductions occur in the United States per year, across a country of more than 300 million people. That number is strikingly small. Of those cases, the overwhelming majority involve child victims. Adult stranger abductions are rare by any statistical measure. Elderly adult stranger abductions are so infrequent as to be nearly without documented precedent in the research literature. And here is the finding that matters most. Even within that already narrow category, the data consistently shows that most victims knew their abductor in some way. The framing of this as a stranger crime does not hold up statistically, which is where the 92% becomes the most important number in this entire investigation. Between 76 and 92% of people killed in the United States knew their killer in some way. That range comes from multiple studies and different research data sets, and while the precise figure varies across the literature, the direction never changes across any of them. If Nancy Guthrie is dead, the dominant statistical probability is that she knew the person responsible for her disappearance, not necessarily as a close friend or trusted confidant. In the forensic sense, knowing someone means any prior contact that generated a degree of familiarity with that person, their habits, or their environment. A contractor who came to the house for repair work, a service worker who visited regularly, someone from her church who knew her schedule, a neighbor who had observed the routine of the property over months or years. Anyone with enough prior access to know the layout of the home, the timing of Nancy's movements, or the details of her finances. The pool of people who qualify as someone Nancy knew, in the forensic definition, is broader than the term suggests in casual conversation, but it is not infinite. It categorically excludes the idea of a total stranger who selected her at random from among thousands of possible targets in Tucson. The footage itself supports that conclusion from a behavioral standpoint, and this is where the forensic analysis becomes most specific. Mary Ellen O'Toole, the retired senior FBI profiler and forensic science program director at George Mason University, who was already introduced in this story's earlier evidence analysis, made a series of pointed observations about the surveillance footage that go beyond the physical description of the suspect. She told NPR that the figure on camera appeared to be somewhat comfortable on a porch to a home where he did not belong and seemed almost used to having been there before. She asked a question that cuts to the center of the behavioral analysis. If this is the first time you have done something like this, how do you know how to dress that way, and what are you preventing if you have never been in this situation before? Her answer was that the reverse is the more likely explanation. The comfort level, the deliberate unhurried movement, the absence of nervous scanning, all of it pointed to prior experience in similar situations. She told CNN directly, they have burglary experience, and she raised a further possibility to CBS News, noting that it is not unrealistic that this individual may have conducted a dress rehearsal before the night of February 1st. Going through the motions in advance to ensure everything fit correctly and was positioned properly. And that someone watching the footage might recognize the clothing from having seen that rehearsal in a different context. That composure under extreme high-risk conditions is precisely what points Dr. Brucato toward a specific clinical construct. And it is important to be clear about what that construct actually means before naming it. The public understanding of psychopathy is shaped almost entirely by its most theatrical and extreme criminal expressions. The clinical research construct is different. Psychopathy as a research profile is defined by reduced emotional reactivity, a diminished fear response that operates physiologically rather than as a conscious choice, in a long history of antisocial behavior that typically begins in childhood or early adolescence and escalates gradually over time. People with this profile do not appear suddenly as fully formed criminals executing complex operations. Their history is scattered with incidents, run-ins with law enforcement over smaller offenses, escalating patterns of conduct that people around them noticed and remembered even when they lacked the clinical vocabulary to describe what they were observing. Someone who can move through an abduction in the early hours of a February morning in a stranger's front yard with no visible physiological anxiety and no behavioral indicators of stress has almost certainly encountered high-risk situations before and developed a tolerance for the pressure that would incapacitate most people. Dr. Brucato's operational conclusion from this profile is specific and actionable, and the individual visible in that footage has very likely been in contact with law enforcement before this case. There is probably a record somewhere in the system. That record may not be for anything resembling what happened to Nancy Guthrie, but it exists. Petty offenses, escalating incidents, behavior that put this person in front of authorities in some capacity at some point in their past. And the people who are most likely to recognize that walk, that posture, that particular and characteristic way of moving through a physical space are not the homeowners and professionals of the Catalina Foothills. They are the people who exist on the margins of the local community, and people who have their own history with the system and who know from direct personal experience exactly who operates in that world and how they carry themselves when they think nobody significant is watching. His recommendation to investigators follows directly from that profile. Talk to people who are currently incarcerated or who have recently been released from custody. Talk to the people living on the margins of Tucson's local community, the people who are unlikely to call a tip line on their own initiative, but who may respond to direct, impersonal contact from investigators who approach them correctly. Someone in that world has seen this figure somewhere other than a television screen. They have encountered that body language on a job site, in a parking lot, at a neighborhood gathering, in a bar. And when they see the footage from Nancy's front door, they will know immediately and without hesitation who that is. The science does not name a suspect. What it does is draw the tightest possible circle around the kind of person investigators are looking for and point directly at where that person is most likely to be found. The statistical profile points to someone Nancy knew, but Dr. Brucato does not believe that person was working alone. The figure on the camera in his analytical framework is the waiter, present, visible, executing the task, but not the one who planned it, not the one who chose the target, and not the one who understood what the operation was designed to accomplish. Behind that figure, Dr. Brucato believes, is a chef, more deliberate, more intelligent. Someone likely carrying a surface relationship with Nancy or with people close to her. Someone living what he describes as a double life, presenting as ordinary or even warm to the world while operating with calculation underneath. The evidence for that division is embedded in the footage itself. The waiter was not a professional. The firearm was worn in a position that former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe and former FBI agent John Nance independently described as something no person with law enforcement or military training would ever do. The backpack was a traceable, off-the-shelf Walmart product. The camera was disabled with foliage pulled from a plant in Nancy's own front yard, rather than any prepared concealment tool. The figure appeared to notice the camera almost as an afterthought, unblocking it after already having been recorded. These are not the operational choices of someone who planned this meticulously. They are the choices of someone handed a task they were not fully equipped to carry out. The question that follows directly is, why Nancy Guthrie? Savannah Guthrie is one of the most recognizable journalists in American television. Targeting Nancy would generate, and did generate, national media coverage, federal investigation, and public scrutiny at a scale that most criminals work hard to avoid. That level of deliberate and foreseeable risk makes sense only if the target was chosen by someone with specific knowledge of her situation. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nenos himself told NBC News he believed this was an individual who had a target for whatever reason. The chef knew something. Well, the waiter was the instrument. Dr. Brucato has written extensively about a concept he calls elimination murder. It describes the killing of someone you know because they represent an obstacle, not a random selection. The motive can be financial, an inheritance, insurance proceeds, access to assets. It can be relational. The victim knows something, witnessed something, or stands between the perpetrator and something they want. The defining characteristic of this pattern is the effort to make the crime appear to be the work of a stranger, because the perpetrator cannot afford to be associated with the victim. Susan Smith in 1994 killed her two young sons and then told police a fictional stranger had taken them, constructing an invented intruder to redirect investigators away from herself. The staging held for a period. Dr. Brucato does not confirm that elimination murder describes what happened to Nancy Guthrie, but the staging elements in this case are consistent with that pattern, and the 92% statistic from the previous chapter does not disappear regardless of which specific motive ultimately proves true. The forensic path forward now has a significant and breaking development. On April 16, 2026, ABC News reported that the FBI recently received and is now analyzing potentially critical DNA recovered from inside Nancy's home. A private laboratory in Florida that works with the Pima County Sheriff's Department had been holding the sample since February. 11 weeks after the sheriff's office sent it to that lab, the Florida facility transferred an original hair sample to the FBI laboratory for testing using new technology. When an FBI official confirmed the Bureau had requested the material over 2 months ago, Sheriff Nanos separately told a local neighborhood watch group that it could take another 6 more months to fully separate the mixture, isolate what investigators need, and produce a usable profile. He also confirmed that as many as 5 other laboratories across the country are working on different aspects of the forensic evidence in this case. With approximately 24 investigators from Pima County and the FBI still actively working the file daily, that timeline reflects the specific challenge the mixed DNA presents. The sample recovered from inside Nancy's property contains genetic material from more than one person. For any comparison or genealogy process to work, the suspect's contribution must be separated from every other contributor in the mixture. C.C. Moore, the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs, has said that if the proportion of Nancy's own DNA is too high relative to the suspect's, there may not be enough markers to build a workable profile. But when asked directly about the eventual outcome, she was unambiguous. She said, "If I was the kidnapper, I would be extremely concerned right now. Because using investigative genetic genealogy, he will be identified. The precedents for that confidence are documented. Joseph James D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer, was identified after more than 30 years through this method. In the Brian Kohberger case involving the murders of 4 University of Idaho students, IGG pointed investigators toward him as a likely suspect, and the investigation subsequently recovered a Q-tip from his father's trash that confirmed the DNA connection. In the Grim Sleeper case in California, Lonnie Franklin was identified through his son's profile using a familial search within CODIS. IGG does not hand investigators an arrest. It hands them a direction. From there, traditional detective work does the rest. Dr. Brucato raised a behavioral dimension that sits alongside the forensic work. Offenders with the psychopathic and narcissistic character structure visible in that footage tend to monitor their own cases obsessively. Kohberger reportedly tracked coverage of the Idaho murders after the fact, measuring how close investigators appeared to be getting. Dr. Brucato believes whoever is responsible for Nancy's disappearance is watching this coverage right now, gauging the heat, measuring what investigators appear to know. That behavior is a vulnerability. Inspector Toski's team in San Francisco understood exactly that dynamic when pursuing the Zodiac killer in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The Zodiac was ego-driven and craved public attention. At a screening of the film Serpico, which featured a character based on the investigation, authorities placed a drop box in the lobby inviting audience members to submit theories about the killer's identity. A police officer inside the box read the notes as they arrived, prepared to act if anyone wrote something only the Zodiac himself would know. The principle is that ego-driven offenders sometimes cannot stop themselves from inserting into the attention surrounding their own crimes. Dr. Ann Burgess recommended separately that law enforcement release more information to the public rather than less, because someone in Tucson has seen the person in that footage in a different context and may not yet understand what they are holding. The combined reward now exceeds $1.2 million. $1 million from the Guthrie family, $100,000 from the FBI, $102,500 from 88 Crime. That amount should be sufficient to move an accomplice. The fact that it has not produced a result points to one of three possibilities. The accomplice is too directly implicated to come forward without destroying themselves. The accomplice is no longer in a position to come forward, or the accomplice is genuinely afraid of whoever sits at the center of this. The investigation itself has faced documented internal scrutiny. Two sources with knowledge of the Pima County Sheriff's Department told Fox News Digital that only one detective on the homicide squad had more than 3 years of experience at the time of Nancy's abduction. The other 5 had less than 2. The sergeant placed in charge of the homicide unit had 6 months of experience as a sergeant and had never personally worked a homicide case before being placed in that role. According to those same sources, at least 2 seasoned homicide detectives had already been reassigned to the cold case division because they were not favored by Nanos's leadership. One was eventually brought in when the investigation transitioned to a task force structure in late February. Sheriff Nanos disputed this characterization directly, telling KVOA on April 3rd that the sergeant had been supervisor of homicide for over 2 years and had solved significant high-profile cases, specifically naming the Reddington homicide and the Goodwill homicide. He added a direct warning to his critics: "You cannot attack my department." The accountability questions about Nanos himself ran deeper. By March 2026, reporters had uncovered his disciplinary history at the El Paso Police Department. Employment records showed he was suspended 8 times between 1976 and 1982, totaling 37 days of suspension or leave without pay. The suspensions involved allegations including use of force, illegal gambling, habitual tardiness, insubordination, improper discharge of his firearm, and dereliction of duties. His publicly posted resume stated his El Paso service continued through 1984. Non-employment records showed he resigned in lieu of termination on August 3, 1982, with insubordination and consistent inefficiency listed as the stated reasons for his departure. That is a 2-year gap between what his resume reflected and when he actually left. A perjury allegation added further weight to the accountability picture. In a December 2025 deposition unrelated to the Guthrie case, Nanos was asked whether he had ever been suspended as a law enforcement officer. He indicated his discipline had been primarily related to not being a good driver. The Pima County Board of Supervisors subsequently pushed the Arizona Attorney General to pursue a perjury charge based on that statement in the documented suspension record. The board voted unanimously to require Nanos to answer questions about his work history under oath. The Pima County Deputies Organization, representing more than 300 officers, passed a unanimous no-confidence vote. Of the members who cast a vote, 241 selected no confidence and resign, while 64 abstained and 0 voted confidence. Union President Sergeant Aaron Cross stated publicly that Nanos had lost the faith of his deputies and his community. Pima County Supervisor Matt Hines called the 42-year tenure with the department something that appeared to be based on fraud. As of this recording, Nanos remained in office. All immediate family members were publicly cleared by Nanos, including Nancy's daughter Annie Guthrie, Annie's husband Thomas Ochoni, who drove Nancy home on the evening of January 31st, and Cameron Guthrie. Ciccioni's blue Honda CR-V was impounded and held for forensic analysis before being returned. The family was described by Nanos as cooperative victims throughout. When content creators and live streamers began descending on the Catalina Foothills neighborhood, filming private homes and approaching residents, including those near Annie and Tomaso's home, law enforcement increased patrols in both areas and condemned the behavior as a distraction from the actual investigative work. As of April 17, 2026, Nancy Guthrie has been missing for 76 days. No suspect has been named. No arrest has been made. Savannah Guthrie returned to the Today Show on April 6th, wearing a yellow dress as a deliberate echo of the yellow flowers and ribbons left at her mother's home. Her opening words were, "We are so glad you started your week with us. And it is good to be home." Co-anchor Craig Melvin, wearing a yellow tie, patted her hand and replied, "Yes, it is good to have you at home." NBC producers put a code word system in place so that if any breaking news arrived about Nancy's case while Savannah was on air, she could be discreetly notified and removed from the set before it broke publicly. On April 15th, 9 days into her return, Savannah stepped away mid-broadcast during an interview she had teased with actress Anne Hathaway, prompting a wave of viewer concern. The show did not address the sudden switch publicly. Savannah returned to the broadcast later in the same episode. A source confirmed to the Daily Mail it was not related to a case update. Outside Nancy's home in the Catalina Foothills, a memorial has grown across months. Messages from Bend, Oregon, New York City, Scotland, Mexico. A banner outside the local NBC affiliate in Tucson reads, "Bring her home," in capital letters, covered in handwritten notes from people across the world. Savannah said something before her return to Today that deserves to close this story. Speaking about whoever took her mother, she said, "I will not let them take my joy. My joy will be my protest." Dr. Brucato said, "Once we know the premise, all of it will make sense." The flowers placed over the camera, the ransom notes sent to newsrooms, the choice of Nancy Guthrie specifically. Right now, these details appear unconnected. They are not. They fit together around a motive that is almost certainly already known to at least one other person who has not yet decided to speak. The reward exceeds $1.2 million. The blockchain is a permanent and traceable record. A hair sample from Nancy's home is inside the FBI laboratory right now, being analyzed with new technology. 5 labs across the country are working different pieces of the same forensic puzzle. 24 investigators are still on the case every day. And the footage of that figure at Nancy's front door has been seen by millions of people on every continent. This case will not stay unsolved because the tools to solve it exist and are actively in use. The question is when the right thread gets pulled and what unravels when it does. Nancy Guthrie deserves that answer. Her family is still waiting for it. If you have any information about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, contact the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or go to tips.fbi.gov. The family reward of over $1 million, the FBI's $100,000, and the 88 crime reward of $102,500 are all still active for credible information that leads directly to a breakthrough in this case. If this is the kind of coverage that stays on a story long after the cameras leave, subscribe to the Whispered Crimes right now. Hit the bell so you are notified the moment we post an update on this case. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from and what you believe is the most important lead still sitting in front of investigators. Because this case is not over, and neither are we.